The morning in Maplewood was quiet, the kind of silence that belonged to neatly trimmed lawns and rows of identical houses lined like soldiers on parade. Sunlight spilled across the cul-de-sac, glinting off mailboxes and dew-kissed driveways. It was the sort of neighborhood designed for peace, order, and rules etched into thick HOA handbooks that residents signed without ever realizing they were signing away pieces of their freedom. At the heart of this suburban empire stood Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of control. She was not just a resident, she was the enforcer, the one who wielded the HOA charter like a weapon, each page another law she could twist in her favor. For years, she patrolled the streets with a clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like a crown, and the certainty that no one could oppose her authority. To her, every crooked mailbox was a rebellion, every slightly tall blade of grass an insult. And if anyone dared to question her, she made sure they paid in public humiliation and endless violation notices. Into this neighborhood of order and intimidation lived a man who had grown tired of her reign. He was not a troublemaker by nature. His life was simple, built on years of quiet work, small comforts, and the kind of independence that comes from owning your own home. His roses bloomed brighter than the others, his lawn was neat, his driveway swept clean. Yet none of it mattered to Karen, for she had decided his roses were an offense. Too wild, too unruly, too defiant against the rigid uniformity she demanded. He ignored her notices, not out of neglect but out of principle. They were his roses, his land, his right. And that defiance planted the seed of war. It began on a morning that would forever fracture the illusion of peace in Maplewood. He stepped out with his cup of coffee, the steam rising into the cool air, only to be greeted by the sight of Karen's gleaming white Lexus SUV sprawled across his driveway. It wasn't parked by accident, it was angled with precision, blocking both garage doors as if it were a barricade in the middle of a battlefield. The vehicle sparkled in the sunlight, polished to perfection, standing not as a car but as a declaration of power. At first, disbelief clung to him like fog. Surely no one could be this bold, this outrageous. But then he saw it, a note tucked under his windshield wiper, written in sharp block letters. A reminder, it said, that no one was above HOA compliance. Trim the roses or face further consequences. It was signed with the flourish of authority, HOA President Karen. The audacity of it struck like a slap. Not content with notices, she had escalated her crusade to physical obstruction, using her car as a tool of punishment. And worse, she had done it in plain sight, where every neighbor could see. The cul-de-sac became a stage, and he the unwilling star of Karen's performance. By mid-morning, whispers stirred the air. Neighbors emerged under the pretense of walking dogs or collecting mail, but their true purpose was to witness the unfolding drama. Teenagers balanced on bikes at the edge of driveways, phones poised to capture every detail. Old couples leaned on fences, shaking their heads but not daring to intervene. It was spectacle, and Karen knew it. She strutted about like a queen surveying her conquest, greeting passers-by with smug remarks about the importance of rules and the dangers of letting one man defy the system. Her Lexus became more than a blockade, it became a monument to her authority. Each day it remained, her power seemed to grow, and the neighborhood's whispers turned into debates. Some admired her boldness, others recoiled at her tyranny, but all watched in fascination. For him, the days that followed were not marked by defeat but by calculation. Anger simmered quietly, not the kind that lashes out recklessly, but the kind that builds into strategy. He tried the usual routes, the police, who shrugged and called it a civil matter, the towing companies, who refused under the contracts Karen had arranged with them. Every door he knocked on was closed, every solution blocked, and Karen reveled in his frustration. She believed herself untouchable, wrapped in the armor of contracts, connections, and her unwavering belief in her own superiority. But he was not a man who surrendered. He was a builder, a planner, someone who understood that patience was a weapon as sharp as any blade. Each night, he sat on his porch, watching her SUV gleam under the streetlight. Each night, he sipped his drink and mapped out a response. Not something petty, not something that could be dismissed as vandalism. No, what he sought was justice, poetic, undeniable, unforgettable. The neighborhood fed on the tension like vultures circling a carcass. Rumors spread of shouting matches, of secret plans, of an impending clash. Even those who once sided with Karen began to shift, their sympathy bending toward the man whose driveway had been stolen. Her victory was starting to sour, though she didn't see it. She believed she had broken him, reduced him to a symbol of her control. But he knew better. He had friends in places Karen never imagined. Old connections from his contracting days, men who dealt with machines far larger and more powerful than a Lexus. Cranes, rigs, and helicopters, tools built to move the immovable. And somewhere in those tools, he saw the shape of his revenge. It would not be enough to simply move her car. No, it had to be a spectacle as grand as the humiliation she had inflicted on him. It had to be public, undeniable, and legendary. The seed of an idea began to grow. At first, it was a passing thought, a wild fantasy. But the more he considered it, the more it took root. What if her Lexus could be lifted, airborne, floating above the cul-de-sac like a trophy? What if her monument to power became the symbol of her downfall? He smiled at the thought, knowing it was possible, knowing he had the means to make it real. Days passed, and Karen continued her parade of arrogance. She walked the streets in oversized sun hats and matching tracksuits, declaring her blockade a lesson in compliance. She waved to neighbors as though she were the benevolent ruler of Maplewood, blind to the storm brewing in the shadows. Her confidence grew, but so did the quiet anticipation of those who longed to see her fall. By the end of the week, the plan was no longer a dream. It was real, sketched out in detail, backed by favors and connections, prepared with precision. And as he looked at her Lexus one final time under the glow of the street lamp, he knew the day was coming when Maplewood would witness a scene they would never forget. The calm before the storm had ended. What came next would shake the neighborhood to its core. The weekend arrived with skies so clear they almost mocked the storm brewing beneath them. Maplewood looked the same as it always did, manicured lawns, cars polished to a shine, neighbors waving politely as if nothing simmered beneath the surface. Yet beneath that calm exterior, tension pulsed like a heartbeat. The blockade remained in place, Karen's Lexus angled across the driveway like a monument to arrogance. Each day it sat there, it became less a car and more a statement, a glowing reminder that she could bend the rules while everyone else bowed to them. But while Karen basked in her illusion of control, another narrative was quietly unfolding. In a small kitchen filled with maps, sketches, and half-drunk coffee cups, the plan for her downfall had taken full form. The man whose driveway she had stolen had stopped being a victim. He was now an architect of retribution, carefully weaving every detail into a tapestry that would leave the neighborhood stunned. The idea had not come lightly. Lifting a car by helicopter was no small feat, even for someone with years of contracting and logistics experience. It required equipment, coordination, and above all, discretion. But he had something Karen didn't: connections forged through years of work and loyalty. Old friends who owed favors, men who thrived in industries where heavy machinery was their daily language. Among them was a pilot with a reputation for precision, a man who could make a steel beam float through the air like a feather. Conversations began in hushed tones, disguised as casual catch-ups but laced with intent. Could it be done? Could a Lexus be lifted without so much as a scratch? The answer came back confident: yes. The machinery existed, the skill was there, and the only ingredient missing was permission. That detail, too, fell into place as if fate itself had aligned against Karen. For what better stage than the mayor's pristine lawn, a man whose friendship with Karen had shielded her excesses, enabling her rise to unchecked power. The symbolism was too rich to ignore. Her fortress of privilege would crumble in the very hands that had built it. The neighborhood, meanwhile, grew restless. Each day without resolution fed the whispers, and whispers became theories. Why hadn't the car been moved? Why hadn't the man fought back? Some speculated he had given up, beaten into submission by Karen's unrelenting pressure. Others claimed he was planning something, their eyes sparkling with the thrill of gossip. Even those who had once feared Karen began leaning toward quiet hope that this time, someone would stand against her and win. Karen herself, blinded by arrogance, mistook silence for surrender. She strutted with a new air of triumph, parading across the cul-de-sac in silk robes and designer sunglasses, stopping to lecture neighbors about their bins, their hedges, their mailboxes. To her, the blockade was proof of dominance. She had reduced an opponent to submission and made an example of him. Each smirk, each dismissive laugh, was a brick in the tower she was building around herself, unaware that towers fall hardest when they stand tallest. The man, meanwhile, played his part flawlessly. Outwardly, he wore the mask of defeat. He pretended to mow around her Lexus, pretended to sigh as if resigned to her reign. He let her believe she had broken him, and in doing so, he gave her the rope with which she would hang herself. Behind closed doors, however, the plan moved forward with precision. Dates were chosen, equipment prepared, logistics mapped out in painstaking detail. The spectacle could not be sloppy, it had to be flawless. A misstep would hand Karen ammunition to twist the narrative, to play the victim, to claim persecution. But if done right, it would be undeniable, her arrogance displayed before the entire neighborhood, her car lifted like a trophy and deposited in a place that would strip away her power. The timing was crucial. Saturday morning, when the neighborhood would be awake but still lingering in pajamas, when coffee mugs would be in hand, and phones ready to capture the spectacle. As the week bled into Saturday, anticipation tightened like a drum. Neighbors, though unaware of the details, felt the charge in the air. Conversations grew sharper, glances lingered longer on the Lexus still blocking the driveway. It had become the centerpiece of Maplewood gossip, a silent battleground no one could ignore. And Karen, reveling in her delusion, continued to feed the fire. The night before the planned operation, he sat on his porch, bourbon glass in hand, staring at the vehicle under the streetlight. The glow reflected off its surface, a mirror to her vanity. Tomorrow, he thought, it would no longer sit smugly in his driveway. Tomorrow, it would soar above the neighborhood like a fallen idol, a symbol of what happens when arrogance goes unchecked. Sleep was fleeting, the kind that comes in restless waves. He woke before dawn, moving through his house in silence, checking notes, reviewing contacts, confirming the steps one last time. The operation had to move with precision, chains secured, straps aligned, flight path clear. A mistake could unravel everything. But as the sun began to stretch across Maplewood, his resolve hardened. Outside, the neighborhood stirred awake. Joggers laced their shoes, sprinklers hissed across lawns, and Karen stepped onto her porch with a smoothie in hand, greeting the day with the smugness of someone who believed the war was already won. She couldn't know that the very stage she had created was about to turn against her. By mid-morning, the faint hum of machinery would grow louder, cutting through the calm. Neighbors would look up from their coffee, eyes widening at the sight of a helicopter descending into their quiet cul-de-sac. And Karen, silk robe fluttering in the breeze, would step outside in disbelief as her Lexus was wrapped in chains and lifted slowly, majestically, into the sky. The neighborhood would cheer, phones raised to capture every second. And for Karen, the moment that began as a triumph would end as her most humiliating defeat. Her blockade, her monument to power, would become the very tool of her downfall. And so the stage was set. The calm of Maplewood was about to be shattered in a way that no HOA rulebook could have prepared for. Saturday morning dawned with an almost deceptive tranquility. Maplewood's cul-de-sac lay bathed in a soft golden glow, the kind of light that made the houses look like something from a real estate brochure. Lawns glistened with dew, birds chirped on telephone wires, and sprinklers spun in rhythmic arcs. For most of the neighborhood, it was just another weekend morning. But for one man, this was no ordinary day, it was the culmination of weeks of quiet planning, the moment where humiliation would be rewritten into triumph. The hours leading to 9 o'clock stretched long and deliberate. Every motion was performed with a calculated calmness. Roses were watered, the driveway was swept, and a robe was tied casually around his waist. To the untrained eye, he looked like a man resigned to another day of enduring Karen's tyranny. But beneath the mask of normalcy, adrenaline surged. He knew that in less than 60 minutes, the balance of power in Maplewood would tilt forever. Karen emerged just after 8, armed with a clipboard and the smug aura of self-importance. She held court on her lawn, delivering yet another impromptu HOA sermon to whoever had the misfortune of walking past. Neighbors stood awkwardly, listening to her rants about bins left askew, shutters painted the wrong shade of beige, and of course, the still unresolved landscaping violation across the street. At one point, she jabbed her pen directly at the man's house, her voice sharp as she declared that certain residents thought they were above the rules. Her audience shifted uncomfortably, some rolling their eyes, others discreetly recording. Karen mistook silence for obedience and basked in it like a monarch before her subjects. At 8:52, while Karen's lecture droned on, he slipped quietly back into his house. One last call to Rodney confirmed what he already knew. The engines were hot. The bird was ready. ETA, 3 minutes. He placed the phone down, exhaled slowly, and stepped onto the porch, the picture of casual calm. Yet, even in stillness, the electricity of the moment hummed in the air. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint, a dull thump-thump-thump carried on the wind. Heads tilted, ears perked. Dogs barked nervously, their instincts sharper than their owners. Within seconds, the sound grew louder, reverberating across rooftops like a war drum. Coffee mugs paused mid-sip. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Eyes turned skyward as the horizon trembled with the unmistakable approach of a helicopter. Karen's face twisted with confusion. She shaded her eyes, scanning the sky. "What on earth?" she muttered, but her words were swallowed by the roar that soon engulfed the cul-de-sac. The helicopter appeared suddenly, cresting the tree line like a mechanical beast. Sunlight glinted off its windows, and the downdraft of its blades bent tree branches into submission. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones shot into the air, capturing every moment. A child squealed, pointing excitedly, while adults exchanged bewildered glances. This wasn't the kind of scene that belonged in suburban Maplewood. The chopper slowed, hovering directly above the cul-de-sac, its blades chopping the air with a deafening rhythm. Wind tore across the lawns, toppling lawn chairs, sending papers and hats flying. Women clutched their hair, men shielded their eyes, and Karen stumbled backward, her robe flapping wildly like a cape caught in a storm. Then the real show began. From the belly of the helicopter, figures descended on ropes, Rodney's team, precise and efficient, moving like commandos. In seconds, they were at Karen's Lexus, hauling chains and rigging with practiced ease. The car gleamed beneath the morning sun, its polished surface now the centerpiece of an unfolding spectacle. The team moved with speed, looping industrial chains around the axles, securing hooks, double-checking every link. The neighbors erupted in disbelief and excitement. "It's happening," someone shouted over the roar. Laughter and cheers broke out, blending with the thundering blades. Phones trembled in eager hands, recording what would surely be the most shared video in Maplewood history. Karen, however, was unhinged. She lunged forward, shrieking commands that vanished into the chaos. Her voice cracked as she screamed about authority, about being the HOA president, about how this was illegal. She clawed at the men working on her car, but the downdraft pushed her back, her words scattering like leaves in the wind. And then, with a sudden metallic groan, the Lexus shifted. The chains tightened. Tires lifted an inch, then two, then clear of the pavement. The car swayed, dangling just above the asphalt, sunlight bouncing off its chrome trim. Gasps erupted, followed by wild applause. Children jumped with glee. Adults who had long endured Karen's tyranny cheered openly, liberated in their laughter. Karen's knees buckled. She fell to the ground, arms outstretched as though she could pull the car back down with sheer willpower. Her face contorted in disbelief and rage. "Put it down," she shrieked, but her cries were drowned beneath the storm of rotor blades and the roar of approval from her neighbors. The Lexus rose higher, chains taut, wheels spinning uselessly in the air. Up it went, swaying like a bizarre suburban ornament. The morning sun hit its windshield, and for a fleeting second, it sparkled like a jewel in the sky. The sight was absurd, surreal, magnificent. Karen's pride and joy, her weapon of control, now dangled helplessly above her, reduced to a powerless spectacle. He stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, robe flapping in the wind. Calm. Unmoving. The eye of the storm. Neighbors looked between him and the helicopter, realization dawning that this wasn't random. This was deliberate. This was payback. Karen screamed his name, pointing wildly, promising lawsuits, vengeance, eternal damnation. But her words meant nothing. Her reign, once built on intimidation, was unraveling in real time. The neighbors who had once feared her now laughed openly, their phones capturing her collapse from tyrant to spectacle. The helicopter began its slow ascent, carrying the Lexus higher above the rooftops. Karen scrambled to her feet, chasing it down the street, her slippers slapping against the pavement. She looked less like a president and more like a desperate child chasing a balloon drifting out of reach. The image burned itself into the neighborhood's memory, a queen reduced to a jester by her own arrogance. The crowd followed, cheering, recording, shouting commentary that would later flood social media. Maplewood, usually so quiet and controlled, had become a theater of chaos, every second more unbelievable than the last. And yet, even as the neighborhood erupted into madness, he remained steady. Because while the others thought the spectacle was ending, he knew it was only the beginning. The car wasn't headed to an impound lot or a field. No, its destination was far more symbolic, far more devastating. The mayor's lawn awaited, a stage grand enough to topple not just Karen, but the empire that had enabled her. The Lexus swayed as the helicopter banked toward the horizon, carrying away not just a car, but years of unchecked power. The cul-de-sac buzzed like it had never buzzed before. Karen collapsed in the street, mascara streaking her face, her shrieks now hoarse and pitiful. Her empire was airborne, and she had no way to stop it. The helicopter cut across the skies of Maplewood, its chains rattling as the Lexus dangled beneath like some surreal chandelier. Below, rooftops and streets blurred past, residents spilling from their homes to gape at the impossible sight. Dogs barked furiously, children pointed with glee, and phones everywhere captured shaky videos destined to go viral within the hour. But while the cul-de-sac simmered with hysteria, its residents torn between disbelief and delight, the true stage of this act was still ahead. For the mayor's estate, an immaculate property with sweeping lawns and wrought iron gates, waited silently at the edge of town. It was here that a new chapter of Maplewood's history would be written, one that would echo far beyond the neatly trimmed hedges of suburban HOA drama. The mayor, a man more accustomed to ribbon cuttings than rotor blades, was seated at his breakfast table when the sound first rattled the windows. His coffee sloshed against porcelain, his fork froze mid-air. Staff hurried to the terrace, eyes widening as the helicopter's shadow stretched across the estate. The thundering machine descended in slow arcs, scattering leaves and shaking treetops. But it wasn't the helicopter itself that made their jaws drop, it was what dangled beneath it. The Lexus, still gleaming from Karen's obsessive polishings, twisted and swayed like a trophy. Its tires spun helplessly, its windshield flashed like a mirror in the morning sun. The mayor rose, incredulous, as the vehicle lowered over his pristine lawn. Grass flattened under the gale of the blades, flower beds tore apart, and the town's most manicured estate became an unwilling landing zone for the most infamous car in Maplewood. The helicopter hovered, chains tightening, until with a heavy thud, the Lexus landed squarely on the center of the lawn. Soil scattered, grass tore, and the immaculate symmetry of the mayor's grounds was shattered in an instant. The crowd of neighbors who had trailed behind by car and bicycle gathered at the gates, pressed against iron bars, recording the moment as though history itself unfolded before them. The helicopter released its chains and rose back into the sky, its mission complete. It turned with mechanical grace and disappeared beyond the tree line, leaving behind silence broken only by the faint creak of the Lexus settling into the grass. The machine that had carried away Karen's pride was gone. What remained was a symbol, her power dismantled, her arrogance uprooted, her car now reduced to a lawn ornament in the mayor's yard. News traveled faster than wind. Within minutes, the first videos hit social media. HOA Karen's car airlifted, screamed captions across platforms. Comments flooded in from across the internet. Some laughed at the audacity. Others marveled at the planning. Many simply couldn't believe it was real. But for Maplewood's residents, there was no disbelief. They had seen it. They had lived it. Back in the cul-de-sac, Karen's screams had turned to sobs. Her slippers hung loose, her hair whipped into tangles, her face streaked with tears and dust. She sat collapsed in the middle of the street, surrounded by neighbors who no longer looked at her with fear, but with something closer to pity and amusement. Her authority had been lifted away just like her Lexus, carried off into the sky, and now she sat powerless in the rubble of her pride. At the mayor's estate, however, the story took on new gravity. The mayor emerged, robe flapping in the wind, staff scurrying at his heels. He circled the Lexus, inspecting it like a crime scene, his disbelief plain for all to see. The cameras pressed to the gates zoomed in, recording every expression. This wasn't just neighborhood gossip anymore, it had become a municipal scandal. By mid-morning, news vans lined the estate. Reporters stood with hair whipping in the wind, delivering breathless accounts of the morning's events. Headlines flashed across local TV, suburban showdown, HOA president's car airlifted to mayor's lawn. Drone footage replayed the helicopter's descent, each frame more unbelievable than the last. Interview clips of neighbors filled screens, some gleeful, some stunned, but all united in one truth: Karen's reign was over. Yet in the midst of spectacle, one figure remained composed. From his porch back in Maplewood, coffee in hand, he watched the coverage unfold on his television. Calm. Detached. The storm had played out exactly as planned, every detail executed with precision. For him, this wasn't just revenge, it was liberation. A neighborhood freed from the chokehold of tyranny. A community no longer silenced by threats of fines and violations. Karen, meanwhile, had not yet accepted her fall. By afternoon, she stormed to the mayor's estate, her robe replaced by a hastily thrown-on dress, her hair unkempt but her fury burning. She demanded explanations, shouted about theft, shrieked about lawsuits. But her words, once sharp enough to cut through board meetings and silence neighbors, now rang hollow. Cameras captured every outburst, microphones caught every shriek. What was once intimidation now played as desperation, and the more she raged, the more ridiculous she appeared. The mayor, exasperated and caught in the media whirlwind, ordered security to escort her off his property. She fought, she wailed, but she was dragged beyond the gates, her protests drowned by the roar of laughter from the gathered crowd. For the first time in years, Karen was not in control. She was the spectacle, the punchline, the fallen monarch in a suburban tragedy. And yet, the story didn't end there. Because while Karen's power crumbled publicly, the aftermath was only beginning. The HOA board, rattled and embarrassed, convened an emergency meeting. Neighbors whispered about replacements, about dismantling her rules, about finally being free from the suffocating grip of her leadership. The Lexus, still sitting stubbornly in the mayor's yard, became a landmark overnight. Strangers drove from nearby towns to gawk at it. Selfies were taken with it. News crews filmed segments in front of it. The once proud vehicle had become a monument to arrogance undone. As the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across Maplewood, one truth was undeniable: the power dynamics of the neighborhood had shifted forever. The queen of fines and threats had been dethroned in spectacular fashion, and her empire lay in ruins, visible for all to see. But even as neighbors celebrated and the internet laughed, there lingered a question. Karen was humiliated, yes, but was she defeated? Or was she quietly plotting her next move, her next attempt to claw back what she had lost? For in Maplewood, peace never lasted long, and behind every manicured hedge lurked another story waiting to explode. The man knew this too. As he finished his coffee and set the mug aside, he understood one thing clearly: this battle might be over, but the war for Maplewood was far from done. The neighborhood had grown restless. What began as whispers over fences and lawn chairs had evolved into something resembling a countdown to a spectacle. By the fifth day, the blocked driveway was no longer just my personal frustration but a community-wide performance. The Lexus had become infamous, drawing curious visitors from the far end of the subdivision. People slowed their cars to catch a glimpse, while kids on bikes staged mock HOA patrols, circling the shiny blockade like guards around a monument. Karen thrived on the attention. She carried herself with the authority of a monarch, her every step rehearsed, her every glance staged for the phones that pointed at her from porches and sidewalks. She believed she had secured an unshakable victory, a proof of her dominance etched into the asphalt of my driveway. But as the crowd grew larger each day, so too did their hunger for something more. Neighbors who once feared her were beginning to wonder if perhaps this time she had gone too far. And that shift in the atmosphere was what I had been waiting for. My plan, carefully woven through late nights and quiet conversations, was no longer just an idea. It had become a timeline, locked in place with precision. Every piece had been checked, every favor called in, every angle rehearsed. Rodney, my old contractor friend, had confirmed the availability of his helicopter and lifting rig. The mayor's lawn had been chosen as the final destination, the one place Karen could never spin into a triumph. What had started as her attempt at public humiliation was about to become her undoing, staged in front of the same audience she had courted so shamelessly. Saturday morning loomed closer, and with it the culmination of everything. On the eve of the event, I sat on my porch in silence, sipping from a glass as the evening breeze carried faint laughter from across the street. Karen was entertaining a few of her allies, the ones who had always cheered her on while quietly hoping never to be her target. They laughed as if her victory was already secured, as if the neighborhood had been reshaped in her image. But the truth was that arrogance always has an expiration date. Hers would arrive at sunrise. The neighborhood thought they had seen a show already, but they had no idea what was coming. Because when the helicopter blades began to thunder through the air the next morning, the real spectacle would begin. And Karen's crown would finally crack. Saturday morning arrived with the weight of expectation hanging over the cul-de-sac. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that makes ordinary moments feel like preludes to history. Neighbors were already outside, lawn chairs lined up like spectators at a parade. Phones hovered in eager hands, ready to capture whatever unfolded. The Lexus sat gleaming in the early light, polished as if Karen knew it would be the centerpiece of yet another day of attention. Then came the sound. A low hum at first, distant and unfamiliar, slowly building into a roar that shook windows and rattled coffee mugs on kitchen counters. Heads tilted toward the sky, and eyes widened as the helicopter emerged over the treetops, its blades slicing through the morning calm. The moment was cinematic, the kind of sight no one in Maplewood had ever imagined witnessing from their own driveways. The crowd gasped as the helicopter descended, the wind whipping through hedges and sending paper cups rolling down the street. Dust swirled, leaves scattered, and children clung to their parents' legs as chains dangled from the machine like steel serpents. The Lexus, Karen's pride and fortress, was no longer a car but a target. The rigging team moved with practiced precision, locking the chains around the undercarriage as the neighborhood held its collective breath. For a few seconds, silence reigned, broken only by the whirring of blades. Then, with a smooth, deliberate lift, the Lexus began to rise. Inch by inch, it left the ground, tires dangling helplessly, sunlight glinting off its windows. The crowd erupted into cheers, disbelief mingling with exhilaration. Phones captured every angle, neighbors shouted in triumph, and the spectacle Karen had engineered for herself spiraled out of her control. Karen appeared too late, bursting from her doorway in a frenzy, her composure shattered. The helicopter carried her Lexus higher, its shadow stretching across lawns and rooftops. It hovered for a moment above the cul-de-sac, as if giving the audience time to truly absorb the fall of their self-appointed queen. Then, with a tilt of its nose, it turned and began its slow, dramatic journey toward the mayor's estate. The flight itself became a procession, visible from blocks away. People stepped out of their homes, drawn by the deafening blades and the surreal sight of a luxury SUV dangling from the sky. By the time the helicopter reached the mayor's manicured lawn, dozens had followed, forming an impromptu parade. The landing was deliberate, precise, and poetic. The Lexus was set down squarely on the mayor's grass, its polished tires sinking slightly into the pristine turf. The message was clear. The car was no longer a symbol of Karen's power but of her downfall. Back in Maplehurst, the crowd slowly dispersed, their laughter and disbelief lingering in the air. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt lighter, as if a storm had finally passed. Karen had built her rule on intimidation and spectacle, but it was spectacle that ultimately unmade her. And as I stood on my porch, watching the last of the dust settle, I knew one thing with certainty: in the war of pride and power, sometimes the only way to win is to lift the battle to heights your enemy can never reach. The reign of Karen was over.